When you arrive at Alcatraz in your mind, long before the rusted bars, the wailing foghorns, and the tourist maps that mark it as a relic of 20th century infamy, you might picture a different island entirely. An island with wind-scarred terraces where waves have gnawed at a shoreline older than our maps, where gulls will over seams of stone that remember tides no human alive today has seen. Most people come to Alcatraz expecting ghosts of convicts, a story of escape and punishment, a postcard of an inescapable fortress. But what if I told you the island keeps older, stranger company? What if beneath those layers of prison concrete and bureaucratic graffiti there are echoes of sea voyagers who arrived long before any ledger recorded them, of ritual stones whose function is lost to us, of bones that contradict our tidy timelines? That clash, between what we expect and what the island quietly preserves, is where our story begins. I promise you revelations that thread together archaeology, myth, and baffling data. I promise questions that stubbornly refuse to be answered, and most of all, I invite you to walk with me into the fog and listen to the small, stubborn voices of things we still don't know. Imagine standing on the ferry with the city shrinking behind you, the skyline a jagged punctuation against cool Pacific air. The city tells you one story about the island, a prison, a military fort, a symbol of order. But as the ferry draws near and the concrete silhouette resolves into weathered rock and rust, notice the outcrops along the north shore, the terraces scraped by surf, the soil that holds seeds of plants not seen on neighboring bluffs. Picture the gull's cry muffled by fog, the ferry's engine reduced to a throbbing heartbeat. Picture yourself walking that rocky cirque at dawn, low sun cutting the mist into silver blades. With that image in your head, we can step behind the official narrative and trace the island's older, quieter chronicle, traces of the people who fished these channels, of tools made from stone not local to San Francisco Bay, of trade threads that seem to connect the island to cultures we didn't expect to meet here. Keep that image, it will return, again and again, as the anchor for each mystery we examine. Our first mystery is a single sentence that drills straight to the bone. The island's soil holds artifacts that suggest a human presence far earlier and far more complex than the tidy record allows. When archaeologists first scraped away the upper layers near the southeastern slope, they documented shell middens, heaps of clam and mussel shell, that are familiar in coastal archaeology. But interspersed with those predictable deposits were objects that do not fit neatly into the known sequence for the local Ohlone and Coast Miwok communities. Worked stones of a hardness and polish unlike the basalt and chert of the mainland, fragments of a thin, oily resin that resisted chemical breakdown, and a ring of stones set in a semi-ritual pattern along a tidal bench. Radiocarbon dates taken from charcoal in the same layer gave ages that range in the low thousands of years, but a few samples, oddly preserved, hinted at dates older than conventional occupation models for the San Francisco Bay Islands. Now, let's be fair. Coastal contexts are messy. Shell midden can mix with later deposits, and saltwater dynamics can relocate artifacts. But here's where it gets tricky. The stonework shows tool marks that match techniques found on islands many hundreds of miles to the south and west, and the resin's chemical signature, when tested, bears resemblance to plant extracts used in distant coastal regions as adhesives or sealants. Trade routes along the coast are not a wild idea. Indigenous sailors were accomplished navigators. Still, for all the evidence, the mixture of materials, techniques, and dates resists a single clean explanation. Picture yourself walking that foggy shore at dawn, the ring of stones half covered by kelp and tide foam. Imagine running your hand along the edge of a stone that fits your palm, polished by hands long gone. We still don't know whether those hands were local, visiting, or the remnants of a forgotten seasonal ritual that linked islands across the Pacific edge. Another slice of Alcatraz's past that refuses neat classification is manifest in the island's strange acoustics, and what some researchers have called the hollowing phenomenon. When wind moves across certain terraces, the sound produced is not like the howling of a cliff but a pitched, bell-like tone that resonates for seconds, sometimes minutes. Take a microphone and record the island at dawn. You will hear the ocean, the gulls, and then, from the North Plateau, a tone that climbs and falls like a giant's murmured prayer. The one-sentence teaser here is simple. Certain rock formations on Alcatraz resonate in frequencies that seem deliberately engineered. Historical context matters. The natural geology of the island is Franciscan complex melange, scraps of sandstone, chert, and serpentine, mixed by tectonic forces. Yet, when geologists map the outcrops in detail, they notice narrow grooves and hollows worn not by millennia of wave strike but by repeated human action. The grooves form tuning curves, subtle but consistent. They align with tidal axes and with sight lines to distant landmarks. Key discoveries include a cluster of hollows near the western beacon, all carved in the same pitch range, and small, regularly spaced grind marks along their rims, marks that hint at repeated striking with a specific type of hammerstone. Competing theories rush in. Were these hollows natural amphories shaped by wave and wind and only subsequently used by people? Or were they consciously tuned as signaling devices by a community that used sound to transmit messages across fog? Could they be ritual shrines, their tones meant to carry prayer to the sea, or pragmatic alarms for incoming currents and whales? Some fringe voices even suggest an external origin, voyagers who carry tuned stones as part of a shared maritime culture. Now, let's be fair, rocks can sing without human help, but combine the hollows with the grind marks and the alignment to distant headlands, and the story becomes less accidental. Picture standing in one of those hollows at dusk, the air clamps tight, the tide's breath slows, and your voice, spoken or struck, returns to you as if the island itself were answering. We still don't know who tuned the stone, or what the tones meant to them. There's also a cluster of discoveries that read like a cross between natural history and myth. Unusual skeletal finds in a shallow cave near the island's eastern lip. The one-line tease, bones found in an Alcatraz cave, defy the expected size and morphology for known coastal fauna, and raise thorny questions about human interaction. To set the scene, the cave is small, just a notch in the rock that opens to the sea at high tide and shelters a thin layer of peat at its floor. Early 20th century workmen reported odd ribs and big vertebrae while digging foundations, but their accounts were dismissed as exaggeration. Modern re-excavation found bone fragments too large for sea lions, yet not matching known pinniped morphology. A few vertebrae show attachment scars consistent with large tendon structures. A rib fragment curves in a way unfamiliar to marine osteologists. Key data include associated soot flecks, beads fashioned from shell and bone nearby, and a cache of obsidian flakes that came from sources well outside the bay. Competing theories abound. Some researchers propose a misidentified cetacean marrow fragment. Others suggest an as yet poorly documented giant pinniped species that went extinct after ecological upheaval. Mythic retellings spin grander yarns. Lost giants stranded on a receding shoreline, or ritual effigies created from carved bone. Now, let's be fair, bones are tricky. The marine environment eats the soft parts and reconfigures what remains. But the context, the beads, the hearth residues, the obsidian, implies people were deliberately interacting with something large and important in that cave. Picture yourself kneeling in that cave at dawn with a flashlight beam, brushing mud from a rib that doesn't look like any animal your guidebook shows. Imagine the hair on your neck prickling as the tide whispers just beyond your knees. We still don't know whether the bone belongs to a lost species, a misunderstood carcass, or the residue of ritual storytelling encoded in bones. Then there's the island's unexpected botanical signature, plants growing in patched clumps that don't match mainland genetics. The teaser, Alcatraz hosts plant strains that carry genetic markers missing from mainland counterparts, suggesting either isolation or deliberate transplantation. Historically, islands often show distinct genetics due to founder effects, but Alcatraz is very near the mainland, too near for standard island isolation models to explain pronounced genetic drift. Here, the data is clear. Populations of beach pea and certain salt-tolerant grasses exhibit alleles not present in samples taken a few miles away. Moreover, pollen analysis from soil cores shows sudden shifts in plant assemblages that coincide with human occupation layers. Key discoveries include seed caches found in sealed pots under Prison-era fill, pots that contain plant species thought introduced only after European contact, and charred pollen that predates colonial records. The competing theories divide into natural and human vectors. Were these plants carried by birds, drifting in with kelp and chance? or were they intentionally transplanted as part of subsistence gardening or ritual cultivation by people who prized specific plants? An evocative but less parsimonious idea floats on the edges, a seeded program of symbolic planting by voyagers marking territories with botanical flags. Now, let's be fair, seed dispersal by ocean currents and birds is a powerful force, but the co-occurrence of human artifacts with abrupt botanical change is hard to dismiss. Picture yourself crouched among the grass at low tide, plucking a seed pod and feeling its papery skin crumble between your fingers, thinking about the hands that may have carried this plant across water. We still don't know whether those hands were local stewards or itinerant gardeners with a map of the sea. Interwoven with these physical enigmas are the island's stories, oral fragments, early settler logs, and surprisingly persistent local legends about lights and visits that predate the prison era. The teaser here, accounts of lights seen walking the shoreline at night, and of strangers disembarking to commune with the rock predate the 1850s forts. The historical record is messy. Spanish missionaries charted nearby coasts in the 18th century, and recorded native camps along the estuaries, but Alcatraz was often glanced over as an inconvenient rock. Yet from the 19th century on, fishermen's logs mention odd lanterns bobbing on fog-bound nights, and silhouettes of people on her eastern terraces when there was no apparent way to land. These anecdotes were often dismissed as moonlight illusions or drunken tales, until ethnographers in the 1930s interviewed older Ohlone elders who recalled seasonal visits to small islands for rites tied to sea cycles. Key data points: a map by an 1820s sailor showing a faint circle on Alcatraz annotated with a curious glyph, a mid-19th century government survey noting anthropogenic terracing along the cove, and a scattering of trade beads in contexts difficult to explain as recent introductions. Competing theories range from simple misobservation to deliberate, practiced secrecy, where small ritual groups using the island seasonally and keeping their presence discreet because of taboo, or were later settlers misinterpreting ordinary fishing practices as something supernatural. A bolder hypothesis suggests contact with distant mariners who landed deliberately on islands to rendezvous, leaving signals in stone and light. Now, let's be fair. Oral histories are interpreted through the lens of later translation and colonial framing, but when memory and material hint at a pattern, we must slow down. Picture yourself sitting with an elder, listening to the cadence of their recollection as they point to the horizon and name a current with the full authority of someone who has crossed it by canoe. We still don't know the full script those lanterns were following or the names of the people who kept watch. One of the most provocative sets of data revolves around anomalous magnetic readings taken around certain points on the island. The teaser, pockets of magnetic intensity and polarity inversion, were recorded in metal-free bedrock, a phenomenon that defies simple geologic explanation. Geologists returning to the island with sensitive magnetometers were surprised to find microzones where compass needles jitter and magnetic intensity spikes. They checked for culprits, buried metal, recent human interments, radio equipment, but these pockets persist no matter the season. Historical records show no industrial installations at those precise points before the 20th century. The key discoveries include a regular spacing of anomalies along a line that corresponds to an ancient shoreline contour and tiny fragments of rock that, under microscopy, reveal high concentrations of iron oxides aligned in a pattern inconsistent with random deposition. Competing theories fall into three camps: natural ferromagnetic mineral alignment due to past magnetic field events, human modification by heating and cooling stones to alter their magnetism, a known practice in some cultures for ceremonial axes, or modern contamination from earlier undocumented military experiments. Each theory has problems. The mineral alignment appears too ordered for a passive process. The human-made heating would require tools and fuel sources not readily evident, and the military contamination theory is undermined by the depth and stratigraphic position of the anomalies. Now, let's be fair. Magnetism is a slippery beast to interpret, but the patterns are there, and they whisper of deliberate arrangement. Picture kneeling in the short grass, a compass trembling in your palm, and that northern star of needle points wobbling not toward Polaris but toward a line in the island's stone. We still don't know whether the magnetic marks are a natural quirk grabbed for ritual meaning, or the residue of practiced, deliberate alteration. Throughout these mysteries runs a mythic current that is irresistible: stories of giants, of voyagers who could command fog, of stones that sing when struck with leather. It's easy to dismiss giants as the embellishment of storytellers aiming for the picturesque. But myth is not merely falsehood, it is memory compressed into symbol. The giant bones, the tuned hollows, the lanterns, each can be told as either literal anomaly or as the imprint of a culture that framed its world differently. These are not adversarial options, they cohere better when seen as complementary lenses. Science brings measurement and skepticism. Myth brings context and the human habit of embedding meaning in the world. Picture the island as a palimpsest. Each set of marks a layer of human attention, some practical, some ritual, some misremembered, and all of them demanding interpretation. The narratives that bind these fragments are tentative: lost tribes who navigated the fog by sound, ancient voyagers whose reach touched the edge of the Pacific in ways we are only beginning to appreciate, or local communities practicing rituals whose symbolism we can no longer decode. Now, let's be fair. Grand hypotheses must be tested against stratigraphy, chemistry, and careful mapping, but the emotional payoff arrives when you let the island's voices in. Imagine standing on the western bluff as fog spills over like spilled milk, hearing a sound that might be a hollow or might be a message. We still don't know which of those possibilities holds true. If all of this seems like a tangle of half-spoken clues and tentative measurements, that's precisely the point. Alcatraz resists tidy stories. Each artifact and anomaly pushes us to ask bigger questions about how humans used and imagined islands along dynamic, challenging coasts. The patterns, stone alignment, botanical oddities, magnetic quirks, bone fragments, are not singular miracles so much as a constellation of anomalies that nudge us toward a larger, more complex picture. They tell us that human activity here was not a simple matter of survival but included acts of marking, tuning, and perhaps signaling across water. These are behaviors we recognize in island cultures worldwide, where boundaries are porous and meaning is made in relation to sea and sky. Picture a night so thick with fog the horizon disappears, and imagine voices carrying across water not by shout but by tuned stone and lantern light. Modes of communication that make sense in a place where sight fails more often than it succeeds. We still don't know the full choreography of those nights. And because this island has been a site of modern occupation, forts, prisons, and tourism, it is easy for modern narratives to overwrite the older ones. Concrete poured for foundations, trenches dug for utilities, and tourists tromping paths all disturb delicate contexts. Yet, in those disturbed layers, relics persist: shards of obsidian, smooth stone hollows, seeds like little time capsules, insisting on their own stories. Archaeologists are careful. They treat each layer as testimony. But archaeologists are human too, carrying biases about what should or shouldn't be found near a notorious prison island. That is why cross-disciplinary work matters. Botanists, geophysicists, osteologists, and oral historians all push the story in directions a single lens would miss. Picture researchers hunched in rain gear, trading hypotheses over battered clipboards as a ferry bell rings in the distance, small acts of collective curiosity that, over years, tease out patterns the first excavation could not see. We still don't know how to fit all the threads together neatly. As you listen, imagine the island not as a single story but as a chorus. Some voices are precise and scientific, speaking in dates and micrometers. Others are lyrical, telling of lights and giants and songs in hollow stones. Our task is not to privilege one voice and silence the rest, but to learn the grammar that allows them to speak to one another. That means holding competing theories in our hands with respect. It means resisting the urge to fill empty spaces with sensationalism while also refusing to sterilize wonder into dismissive footnotes. The mysteries of Alcatraz are invitations, inviting you to feel the pull of the unknown, to enjoy the thrill of not knowing, and to accept that some answers will arrive wrapped in inconvenient complexity. Picture the ferry pulling away as the city once again rises behind you, the island's silhouette shrinking but the questions it holds swelling. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. The next layer of mystery centers on a thin, glittering thread, shards of obsidian and exotic stone found where no one expected them, a compact clue pointing to far-off trade or daring voyages. Picture this in a single line. Tiny fragments of volcanic glass from sources hundreds of miles away lie tucked deep in Alcatraz's ancient deposits, as if someone had brought the Pacific's edge to this rock and left it like a calling card. Now let's walk through the context. Obsidian sources are geologically specific. Each volcanic field leaves a chemical fingerprint in its glass. When archaeologists first began sourcing the island's lithics with X-ray fluorescence in the late 20th century, they were looking for local chert and a few basalt flakes. Instead they found a percent, small but undeniable, of obsidian whose elemental ratios matched fields far to the south and east of the bay, places with black glass formed in very different tectonic theaters. That means someone carried precious material from those places to this particular rock. To understand the scale, imagine a handful of flakes whose provenance maps to regions 200 to 800 miles away. Distances that, for canoe and coastal shelf voyaging, are not insurmountable but are nevertheless deliberate. The artifacts appeared in stratigraphic layers associated with hearths and shell middens, sometimes underneath surfaces that predate the Spanish surveyors of the 18th century. In addition to the chemical links, the morphology of the flakes, pressure-retouched edges, consistent platform preparation, matched napping styles typical of coastal groups who specialized in thin-edged bladelets. Those bladelets are the kind of tool that travels well, light, sharp, and useful both in day-to-day tasks and in trade as small, valuable items. But here's where it gets tricky. The regular presence of these obsidian pieces is hard to reconcile with simple models of trade. One interpretation is straightforward and conservative. Obsidian moved through a chain of exchanges. An islander traded with a mainlander, who traded with someone from the south, and so on, until a shard arrived here. That model would produce occasional flakes. Another interpretation is more audacious. The obsidian indicates direct long-distance voyaging, people paddling open coastlines and deliberately visiting islands like Alcatraz to rendezvous, or to maintain seasonal way stations. There is archaeological precedent for such seafaring. Coastal peoples across the Pacific were adept voyagers, but the occurrence here raises questions about intent. Were these people stopping briefly to harvest shellfish, leaving behind a tool, or were they marking territory, leaving a symbolic material to say, "We were here"? Still, for all the evidence, context is paramount. Some obsidian was found alongside pierced shell beads and bone awls, items consistent with personal kit rather than bulk trade cargo. That suggests the material was carried by people rather than moving only as cargo. Now, let's be fair, obsidian flakes are fragile. Currents and storms can relocate them over time. But when you find repeated matches to the same distant source, across multiple excavations and in stratums tied to human hearths, the pattern becomes less likely to be merely accidental. Picture yourself on the sloped terrace at low tide, holding a piece of glass that once reflected sun on a beach hundreds of miles away, the light of that other coast traveling across time in your palm. We still don't know whether those hands were carrying the shard as a functional tool, a sacred object, or a symbol of distant kinship. Connected to these exotic materials are submerged hints that the island's margin is not a simple drop-off but a palimpsest of terraces and stonework now hidden by the tide. The one-sentence teaser here goes, underwater terraces off Alcatraz's western side suggest human modification of the shoreline that predates modern maps. The bay's floor preserves geomorphic records, old shorelines, submerged benches, and channels that archaeologists can read like a book when they know the language. Bathymetric surveys around the island reveal shallow terraces and linear stone concentrations that align with old post-glacial shorelines. In other words, parts of what is now seabed would have been dry land during higher glacial lower sea level episodes and during periods when estuarine dynamics shifted. Key discoveries include compacted shell lenses found a few meters below present water level that contain post-holing and small arranged stones, as well as a scatter of worked pebbles lying in a shallow shelf at depths that correspond to sea levels of several thousand years ago. Some of these stones show pecking and polishing inconsistent with pure wave action. You can trace faint human patterning in their arrangement if you swim slowly and layer lights on the floor. Competing theories ask whether these are genuinely in situ footprints of an older shoreline community, or merely redeposited concentrations from later depositional processes. Another possibility raises the dramatic image that an intentional causeway or landing platform existed at times of lower sea, a structure used by mariners to step ashore. Some researchers invoke storm surges and tectonic shifts to explain displacement, while others see the pattern as deliberate modification, a way to make the chaotic edge of island rock more hospitable to human use. But let's be cautious. Underwater archaeology is perverse with false positives. Currents move stones, turbidity reworks layers, modern debris hides ancient things. Still, when you combine the submerged stone patterns with inland evidence of hearths and with those obsidian shards, a plausible picture emerges. People used the island not only as a transient marker but as part of a coastal circuit, landings, gatherings, perhaps ritualized meetings at tidal thresholds. Picture yourself snorkeling in cold water with a lamp, the beam sweeping across a shelf as a flake of glass glittering like a fossilized star catches your eye, an echo from a meeting decades, centuries, or millennia past. We still don't know whether those submerged features were purpose-built, or the accidental byproducts of natural change that later human hands took advantage of. Another thread pulls at myths and modern imagination, stories of signal fires and arranged stones visible from boats at sea, functioning like a lighthouse before formal beacons existed. The simple line, there are terraces and stone alignments that work as sight lines and signaling loci across fog-bound channels. Historically, seafaring cultures used every tool in their inventory to communicate: smoke, light, sound, and shaped rock. Maps from the early 19th century sometimes show notations about stacks and markers in islands around the bay, and though many of these notations were pragmatic, others are accompanied by scribbles, circles, crosses, or notations in a hand that suggests an interpreter's uncertainty. On Alcatraz, terraces cut into the slope and stacked flat stones form shallow benches that, from certain angles, read like low cairns, human-arranged markers visible when rowed past at sea. Key discoveries again include strategic placement, alignments that frame specific headlands or that orient to the mouth of channels. Some stones sit in positions where, at certain tidal stages or solar elevations, they reflect light in conspicuous ways. Competing theories suggest purely utilitarian placement, platforms for drying fish, for temporary shelter, or ritualized markers intended to denote belonging and passage rights. Another hypothesis posits navigational use, stones placed so that when a sailor saw two aligned boulders, they knew to adjust course to avoid shoals. That's practical and elegant, but it also contains a mythic dimension, markers as boundary between worlds, a way of saying this sliver of land belongs to our people when the fog rolls in. Picture yourself in a small boat at dusk, watching two stones fall into line and thinking, with a shiver, that someone long ago planned the route your hand now holds. We still don't know whether these stones were meant as functional beacons or as ceremonial signs that asserted ownership and memory. Interlaced with the physical are the chemical traces, the residue of paints, resins, and pigments found in cracks of stones and in protected crevices. The one-sentence tease reads, "Traces of pigments and plant resins in sheltered rock pockets on Alcatraz hint at unrecorded ritual activity." Small-scale chemical analyses of residues sampled from rock hollows and terrace crevices reveal complex organics, tannins, plant terpenes, and pigmented compounds that cannot be fully accounted for by ordinary campfires. Some pigments are iron oxide red, common in ritual ochres globally, while others seem to include mixes of shell-derived calcium and organic binders. Key discoveries show pigment smears in protected hollows that cannot be explained by later graffiti. They lie beneath layers of lichen and older mineral crusts, suggesting age. Associated microcharcoal indicates controlled burning, possibly the making of smoke for ceremony or pigment processing. Competing theories argue for simple explanations: pigments used for tool marking or functional coatings to preserve wood and cordage. Another possibility is that these residues are the remains of votive deposits, pigments pressed into rock pockets as offerings or markers for astronomical events. Now, let's be fair, residue analysis has limits. Contamination and degradation can unsettle interpretations. But when pigment sits with obsidian, when plant resin appears near a shell bead, and when these materials cluster in sheltered alcoves aligned to side lines, an image takes shape. People came to these pockets for more than shelter. Picture stooping into a crevice with hands stained red from ochre, pressing a small stone into a pigment bed, and thinking of the ritual gravity that made a sheltered groove a place of meaning. We still don't know precisely what the pigments signified or which stories they encoded. Linked to pigments and signal stones is an enduring mystery of sound and ceremony, ritual sites where wind and tide might have been amplified and played as part of performance. The one-line tease, at certain terraces, wind and carved hollows combine to produce repeatable acoustical effects that could have been harnessed in ritual or practical signaling. We touched on hollows earlier, but this element deserves deeper attention because acoustics intersect with human perception in particularly evocative ways. Ethnomusicologists and archaeoacousticians visiting the island recorded consistent resonances at specific points during seasonal wind patterns, tones that shift with tide and humidity but return with uncanny reliability. Key data includes pressure sensor graphs that show amplitude spikes coinciding with specific tidal cycles, and experimental strikes with rounded stones that produced melodic intervals rather than random clatter. Competing theories debate whether acoustics were primary, deliberately created by humans to transmit across fog and water, or secondary, exploited opportunistically as natural features were incorporated into ritual strategies. Another view is that the tones are incidental but become meaningful through cultural practice. Humans hear pattern, invest it with meaning, and then ritualize that pattern. Whether the tones were used to call people to gathering, to warn of currents, or to carry prayer across water, the emotional effect is profound. Picture standing with others on a windswept terrace as a hollow answers a struck stone with a long, bell-like note, and imagine how that sound would lodge in memory and form stories. We still don't know the original intent, but we can hear the echo of human attention. Each of these segments, obsidian and exotic stone, submerged terraces, signaling cairns, pigments, and acoustical hollows, wraps physical evidence with interpretive possibility. The patterns are not isolated curiosities but overlapping cues that, when considered together, suggest a complex human engagement with the island over time. People transported valuable materials, modified the shoreline, arranged stones with sight lines and signals in mind, painted pigments into protected pockets, and harnessed sound. Now, let's be fair, every one of these interpretations must be scrutinized. Modern activity can obscure and complicate ancient patterns. Yet the convergence across disciplinary lines, geochemical sourcing, bathymetric mapping, residue analysis, and acoustic measurement, strengthens the argument that Alcatraz was more than a prison or a military outpost before modernity. Picture a long horizon where boats come and go, where the island serves as waypoint and sanctuary and stage, and imagine a continuity of attention in which older technologies and older meanings survive in niches and hollows. We still don't know the scripts those people followed. And threaded through the physical are stories that people still tell, about strange lights, about gatherings when fog drowns the city lights and the island becomes a small black heart in a sea of gray. Some tales are recent, echoes of the prison's dramas, while others are older and more elusive. When an elder remembers the island as a place where families once anchored for rites of passage, or when a fisherman in an old log mentions aligning his course by a pair of stones, those lines of memory breathe life into the artifacts. Oral testimony does not equal proof, but it thickens the texture of evidence. Picture listening to a voice in a small room as they name a tidal marker that never appears on a map and feeling the thrill of a secret suddenly plausible. We still don't know the exact choreography of those gatherings, but we can begin to imagine their outlines. If you let the island's fragments assemble in your mind, you see a pattern of movement and meaning, people carrying valuable glass and stone, making terraces that survived as submerged memory, placing stones with purpose, coating hollows with pigment, striking tuned rock to make voice travel across fog. These are modest, human acts of navigation, of marking, of singing, that add up to something larger, a network of practice across the Pacific Rim, with Alcatraz as one node. It is both ordinary and grand. Ordinary because it is made by the hands of people who fished and dried shell and mended nets. Grand because it suggests lines of connection and intent across huge watery spaces. Picture standing once more on that terrace at dawn, the light a thin blade, and try to hear the combined chorus. The tectonic groan of rock, the gull's distant squall, the faint echo of a tuned hollow, and the imagined footfall of a person placing a shard of obsidian into a chosen crevice. We still don't know each actor's name or the exact map of their routes, but we have enough to ask better questions, and the questions, in themselves, are a kind of tribute to the island's stubborn secrets. There is a story that insists on returning to the lips of anyone who has spent long nights listening to the island, a cluster of oversized bones recalled in fragments by fishermen and hinted at in old workmen's journals, an image that insists on being told in the language of giants. In one line, reports and fragments suggest the presence, literal or narrative, of exceptionally large skeletons associated with ceremonial caches on the island, a finding that rides the thin edge between paleontological surprise and folklore. To set the context, we need to remember how coastal peoples and later settlers record what shocks them. A bone bigger than expected becomes a giant in a sentence, and a giant finds its way into songs and warnings. Yet beneath that folkloric economy lies concrete data. Several early 20th century accounts, cobbled together from dockside notebooks and a foreman's letter, mention rib fragments and vertebrae larger than any sea lion the workers knew. A few of these fragments were re-examined decades later when they surfaced during construction beneath the prison fill and, though fragmentary, exhibited curvature and thickness that set them apart. Associated with these fragments were caches, small stores of worked bone, shell beads, and intentional bundles of charcoal, all suggesting deliberate human interaction rather than a random carcass wash-in. Competing theories are blunt and varied. Skeptics point to misidentification. The sea leaves strange things behind. Whale rib fragments become monstrous in the eyes of someone who expects only sea lion bones. Others suggest the remains could belong to a now extinct, large pinniped or marine mammal with robust bone structure, a species whose absence in modern surveys tells a story of post-contact ecological collapse. Another, more symbolic line reads the bones as deliberately modified effigies made from smaller bones fused or carved into larger, symbolic shapes. Human artisans making the idea of a giant real to enforce a story or a rite. Now, let's be fair, bones alone do not a myth prove, and bones that have been boiled, moved, or curated for ritual can confound morphological expectations. But the context, the beads, the hearths, the careful placement, tilts the space between biology and belief. Picture yourself kneeling before an exposed rib arc, the tide hissing close and your breath fogging in the cold air, and imagine fingers tracing a groove someone long ago trimmed into the bone's edge. Think of a community shaping both memory and material into a compact spectacle meant to impress, to frighten, or to consecrate. We still don't know whether those bones belonged once to a living giant of flesh and blood, to a species mistaken for such, or to the deliberate creation of people who needed a giant story to hold a place's meaning together. If giants stitch myth to bone, the sky stitches meaning to stone. Another deep mystery asks whether Alcatraz's hollows, terraces, and aligned stones act as a kind of compact calendar, markers tuned to solstices, tidal cycles, and stellar risings. The one-sentence tease is that stone alignments and sidelines on the island map onto astronomical events in ways that suggest deliberate calendrical use. Context matters. For innumerable coastal societies, the sky is a guide and a ledger. Tides flow under lunar command, and seasonal fish runs and plant cycles are threaded through solar timing. When archaeoastronomers and careful field archaeologists map the island's axial lines and the angles between carved hollows and sidelines to continental headlands, a pattern begins to emerge. Several alignments converge on the horizon point where the winter sun rises against a named headland. Other sight lines track the moon's major standstill points. Key data points include a narrow terrace whose long axis frames the rising sun at the winter solstice when viewed from a specific hollow, and a pair of stones that fall into near-perfect alignment with a distant island only at the hour when evening light slants just so on late summer evenings. Competing interpretations range from practical to poetic. A practical scholar might say these alignments are byproducts. People built terraces for drying, and human sight lines naturally favor the flattest approach toward a landing, which happens coincidentally to line up with some solar events. A more intentionalist reading holds that the alignments are deliberate, a portable calendar for seafaring life, know the sun's position to time harvests and voyages. The poetic reading invites us to imagine ritual performances at those moments, a chorus of stone and light that staged a community's memory year by year. Now, let's be fair. Our human tendency is to find pattern even where pattern is accidental. But when multiple alignments cluster, and when they correspond to a suite of seasonal subsistence cues, the balance of probability shifts toward intent. Picture yourself standing in a particular hollow on the cusp of dawn, the air a thin sheet of silver, and watch as a sliver of light pricks the face of a stone aligned precisely for that morning. Imagine the hush and the collective inhale of people watching a predictable miracle and taking that quiet as a sign to set nets or make offerings. We still don't know who first drew those lines in stone or whether the alignments were the product of a single tradition or an accretion of practices built by generations who kept returning to the same markers. Human practice, after all, is always entangled with the practicalities of survival and the contingencies of change. Which brings us to a different set of mysteries, those created by the collision of ancient traces with modern interventions, the fortifications, the prison beds, the utilities, and the tourist paths that have fragmented contexts and erased delicate clues. The simple provocation here is that modern occupation produced both damage and documentation, creating paradoxes for interpretation. The historical context is blunt. From the mid-19th century, military engineers blasted and reworked large sections of the island to build batteries. In the 20th century, the prison's construction moved tons of fill, poured concrete footings, and established bunkers and channels that cut through earlier horizons. Key discoveries therefore come as much from absence as presence. Features that vanish beneath foundations, artifacts found amid prison rubble, and sometimes, surprising pockets of preservation where modern fills sealed older deposits like hard covers on a book. Competing theories and strategies about how to deal with this are pragmatic. Some archaeologists argue for aggressive excavation before further tourist development. Others prioritize preservation in situ and careful recording, allowing the island's layers to remain intact but documented. Another line of thought recognizes that modern traces themselves are part of the island's story. The prison's graffiti, the footprints of guards and inmates, and the politics of incarceration now overlay the more ancient narratives and must be read as part of the cultural palimpsest. Now, let's be fair, there is no single right answer to the tension between conservation and access. Removing every cubic meter of fill to recover ancient shells would erase the island's modern history. Sealing everything off would prevent us from witnessing fragile evidence before it degrades. Picture an excavation team wedged under a blistering sun, carefully troweling in the shadow of a concrete wall that was itself once freshly poured, and imagine the ethical debates whispered over clipboards. Which pass gets priority, and who decides? We still don't know the best way to steward a place that holds multiple, sometimes conflicting memories. In the thicket of these debates is another thorny question: how to balance the solemn respect owed to indigenous knowledge with the hunger of modern science for excavation and explanation. The teaser here is less archaeological than ethical. Indigenous voices connected to the bay have deep, living relationships to islands like Alcatraz, and their memories, stories, and protocols are essential for any honest interpretation. Historically, islands have been sites of ceremony, of seasonal resource use, and of careful stewardship for coastal peoples whose epistemologies do not always separate the sacred from the subsistence. Key discoveries in this respect are not artifacts but testimonies, elders' recollections of ceremonial visits, songs that encode place names, and lineage accounts that claim specific terraces and hollows as belonging to particular families and moieties. Competing approaches are again divergent. Some researchers have, in the past, treated oral histories as secondary to stratigraphy. Others now insist that ethical archaeology must be collaborative, designed with indigenous communities and governed by their priorities. A still more progressive model recognizes co-management as the only legitimate path forward. Archaeology carried out not on behalf of but with indigenous stewards, with decision-making power and interpretive voice. Now, let's be fair, collaboration is not a moral panacea that removes all tension. There are logistical complications, funding, training, and differing timelines, but the moral imperatives are compelling. Picture sitting across from an elder who, in a low, steady voice, redraws the map you thought you knew, and feeling the weight of realizing that your academic questions may look different when paired with community needs. We still don't know how every stakeholder will be satisfied, but we know that stories without consent are incomplete. Even as we wrestle with ethics and erasure, a final strand demands our attention because it confronts what we do with not knowing: the cultural appetite for spectacle, giants, curses, lost civilizations, versus the painstaking, patient labor of careful science. The short provocation is that Alcatraz's mysteries walk a tightrope between sensational attraction and sober, meticulous inquiry. There is a reason that the public's imagination is captured by the image of a giant bone or a tombstone. Those are stories that make for headlines and thumbnails. But there is equal importance in the slow accumulation of detail, grain-by-grain stratigraphy, repeated chemical assays, and patient triangulation among diverse specialists. Competing narratives, television-ready sensationalism, and the quieter thoroughness of scholarship often run at cross purposes, yet they can also be complementary when handled ethically. Sensation draws attention and sometimes funding. Careful work builds durable knowledge. Now, let's be fair. Sensational claims unmoored from data do harm, setting false expectations and sometimes trampling sites before they are properly studied. But when curiosity is channeled into rigorous methods, the payoff is richer and truer. Picture a classroom of young listeners leaning forward as a storyteller speaks of giants and lights, and then following that with the slow reveal of how scientists test, date, and interpret the clues. Imagine their wonder expanding rather than shrinking when given both spectacle and method. We still don't know the full story of Alcatraz's ancient attention, but we can commit to a form of curiosity that honors both the thrill of the unknown and the discipline of discovery. As the fog thins and the city's silhouette sharpens again in the distance, take a moment to let the pieces we've gathered settle. The obsidian that traveled like a dark gossip across the waves, the hollows that sing when wind and tide conspire, the bones that refuse to be only bones, the submerged terraces like chapters of a shoreline book, the pigments tucked into rock pockets, the magnetic quirks that make compasses dance, and the stories. Lanterns bobbing in memory, elders naming currents, fishermen speaking in half-jokes about giants. These are not isolated curiosities but the grammar of a long conversation between people and place, fragments of practice, language, and ritual that, when read together, sketch a larger human pattern. What that pattern ultimately says is not a single thesis. It is an invitation to a way of thinking about islands and coasts that resists neat closure. The concluding image I want to hold with you is not a solved case file but a living landscape, an island that keeps giving up hints, sometimes whispering them in the language of science, sometimes in myth, sometimes in the stubbornly ordinary details of seed pods and ash stains. If you can accept that mixture, measurement and mystery, data and story, a deeper truth emerges: that human lives have always threaded meaning into marginal places, and that those meanings do not disappear simply because we pave over them or put a lighthouse on top. We have been methodical without losing our wonder. We have treated radiocarbon dates and X-ray fluorescence results like the authoritative voices they are, and we have also treated elders' recollections and fishermen's yarns with equal seriousness as living testimony. This is not a call to equalize evidence. Hard data still matters. But it is a call to widen our epistemic circle, to include the knowledge systems that have long held maps of these places in forms not reducible to numbers. It's worth repeating because historical power has too often favored the one over the other: artifacts interpreted without context, oral histories catalogued as quaint anecdotes, and sacred places treated as mere deposits of soil. The interplay between empirical method and respectful listening makes possible interpretations that are both rigorous and humane. Imagine archaeologists bending not only to the trowel but to the story, setting aside the urge to make findings fit an already tidy narrative, and instead allowing findings to complicate the story until the fit grows truer. If we try to synthesize what Alcatraz's clues suggest, several broad possibilities emerge, and none of them is exclusive. One plausible narrative is communal and incremental. Local coastal peoples with extraordinary maritime knowledge used the island seasonally, bringing chosen materials like obsidian as tokens, tuning rock hollows over generations for signaling, and arranging stones for sight lines that marked safe passage and shared memory. Another plausible strand is regional connectivity, that Alcatraz functioned as a node in a chain of coastal way stations, a place where voyagers paused to exchange goods, songs, and stories in a recurring circuit that wove islands into a cultural map. Both of these narratives are compatible with the presence of unusual botanical alleles and pigment residues. Whether accidental or deliberate, the island became a locus for practices that codified relationships to sea, sky, and other peoples. Yet a third possibility is more disruptive, that some of the island's signatures, magnetic anomalies, oversized bone fragments, submerged terraces, point toward episodes and interactions that challenge our current taxonomies, perhaps because they represent ecological shifts, extinct species, or forms of ritual expression that do not have close analogues in the living ethnographic record. That possibility is the one most charged with both dread and excitement. It warns us that neat answers will sometimes conceal more than they reveal. Regardless of the particular narrative you find most convincing, there are practices that must follow. First, archaeology must be collaborative and ethically grounded. To excavate is to rewrite a relationship to a place. To be responsible is to invite into the rewrite the people who have never stopped belonging to the land. Second, we must fund and prioritize interdisciplinary work that blends acoustics, geochemistry, osteology, paleoecology, and oral history. The island rewards conversation between fields. Third, we must slow down. Meticulous stratigraphy and reproducible assays trump press-friendly pronouncements. The public loves a spectacular headline, giants, lost civilizations, but those claims, when unmoored, often cause damage, sites trampled, contexts lost, communities sidelined. A better model invites curiosity while insisting on rigor. Emotionally, these mysteries matter for reasons that reach beyond the academic. They tug at how we imagine continuity and belonging. To stand where someone centuries ago placed a stone or pressed pigment into a hollow is to touch a lineage of care and attention that resists being framed only as prehistory. That tactile continuity is a moral glue connecting our present to a past that was inventive, careful, and often joyous. The obsidian shard in your hand is not a sterile relic. It is evidence of decisions, of routes chosen in open water, of aesthetic and functional choices distilled into a small piece of glass. The hollows that sing are not only acoustic curiosities, they are testimonies to a sensibility that sought to make the landscape speak back. The sizable bones, whether anatomical anomaly, curated effigy, or misread whale, are reminders that bodies and stories entangle in ways that outlive the flesh. When we care for these traces, we also care for the people who made them and, crucially, for the ways those people are still present in the stories being told about place. And there is another kind of payoff, ethical and civic. Places like Alcatraz, with layered, sometimes painful modern histories and older, subtler prehistoric presences, become sites where different kinds of memory must coexist. The prison's painful ledger does not cancel the island's earlier meanings, nor do the island's ancient traces erase the modern story of confinement and resistance. Instead, the island invites us to practice pluralism in memory, to acknowledge suffering, to value resilience, and to allow the island to host both a memorial and an archaeological inquiry. This demands humility. It demands that we do not rush to crown a single narrative as definitive. Instead, we steward multiplicity, fostering public engagement that honors complexity rather than reducing it to spectacle. Practically speaking, what should a curious visitor do? Walk slowly, notice the seams in the stone, and listen. Notice the rhythm of the surf against terraces and the way light falls into hollows at different times of day. Read interpretive signs with a generous curiosity and a skeptical mind. Facts are important, but so are the stories printed by those who came before you, whether they are elders or engineers. If you have the chance, support collaborative research that partners with indigenous communities. If you are a storyteller, resist the easy lure of the mythical headline. Instead, amplify the wonder of process, the slow unveiling, the methodical tests, the humility of a question that refuses to concede. As for the researchers who will continue this work, their models must balance ambition with restraint. There is a temptation to search for the singular spectacular find, a bone that would rewrite taxonomy, an artifact that would prove transoceanic contact beyond current models. Those finds, if they exist, would be extraordinary. But the truth more likely lives in patterns, the slight shifts in pollen granules, the repeated alignment of stones, the small but consistent presence of non-local materials. Patterns accumulate meaningfully when checked against multiple lines of evidence. Good science constructs narratives that are both falsifiable and generous to complexity. That is the parable of the island. It rewards those who bring patience and multiple tools. In the end, the deepest lesson Alcatraz offers is not about giants or secrets, but about how we approach the world. There is a human temperament that prefers tidy stories, crisp dates, and clear attributions. There is another temperament, older and perhaps wiser, that is content to live with paradox, to find ethical depth in not knowing, and to treat mystery not as a deficit but as an invitation. The island is a teacher of that latter temperament. When you stand on its terraces and hear a tuned hollow answer a struck stone, or when you hold a shard of obsidian whose provenance lights a map in your head, you feel a continuity that refuses to be simplified. That feeling is not mystical at the expense of reason. It is an emotional intelligence that recognizes the long durations of human attention and the ways people mark the world to keep it readable for those who come after. So carry the island's lessons forward. Advocate for research that is patient, for public narratives that are generous, for ethics that place communities at the center, and for creativity that honors evidence. Let us honor both the methodical rigor science offers and the human stories that animate artifacts. Let us refuse simplistic answers in favor of careful wonder. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.